What story sounds fake but is 100% true? Charles Holden was on his way home from work when he decided to stop at a fast food restaurant near his house in Harrington, Delaware. After grabbing a quick bite to eat, Charles left the store and got back into his truck. He turned it on and was about to drive out of the lot when he stopped. There was a man running towards him, waving, trying to flag him down. Charles put his truck back in park and rolled his window down to see what this guy wanted. When the stranger got close enough, he told Charles that his sister was having a baby and he needed a ride to the hospital, which was about 20 minutes away. Charles couldn't tell if this guy was lying. It was super late, he didn't know this guy, and he just had a bad feeling about him. So he told him, "No, I'm sorry, it's too late. I got to go home. It's too far out of the way." The stranger immediately looked dejected and turned around, starting to walk away. As Charles was watching him go, he felt bad and said, "You know what? Hey, come back here. I'll give you a ride part of the way there." So the stranger smiled, hopped in his passenger seat, and they took off. Charles drove him approximately 3 miles in the direction he had asked to go before pulling over on the side of the road and telling him, "This is as far as I'm going to take you." Charles lived only about a block away and didn't want to drive too far away from home so late at night. But the stranger, upon hearing he was being let out so soon, suddenly became angry. He began fumbling in his pocket like he was going to get a knife or some sort of weapon and started screaming at Charles, "Hand over your keys. Hand over your wallet, or I'm going to kill you." Charles, meanwhile, was on edge, just being in the car with this guy because he had a bad feeling about him. He immediately jumped into action, turned off his truck, ripped the keys out of the ignition, and left out of his truck. Charles saw a convenience store in the distance and went on his way to get help. As he was running, he turned around and saw the stranger, who had also left out of the car and was now sprinting up to him with a screwdriver in his hand. This stranger was running really fast. He was gaining on Charles. Soon Charles realized he wasn't going to make it to the convenience store before this guy caught up to him. So at some point, Charles just stopped, turned around, and put his hands up, saying, Okay, I'll give you a ride wherever you want to go, and then you can have my keys, my wallet. You can have anything you want." So the stranger ran right up to Charles, stopped, and smiled because he was very pleased with this result. He poked him with a screwdriver and gestured for him to go back to the truck. So Charles walked back to the truck with the stranger right behind him, periodically poking him in the back with a screwdriver. They finally reached the vehicle, and the stranger told Charles to get in the car and wait. As Charles sat down, he fired up his truck and sped off before the stranger could hop in the passenger side door. He saw the stranger at some point stop, turn around, and walk away. Charles was totally relieved that he had escaped this horrible encounter. He was thinking about calling the police but ultimately decided he wouldn't because it was his decision to allow some stranger to get in his car in the middle of the night. Charles was concerned about where he had ditched the stranger. It was not far from his house, and he was worried that if he just turned around and drove right back to his house, this guy could recognize the truck and then follow him to his house. Who knows what could happen? Charles decided he was just going to stay outside of town and drive around for a while to make sure the stranger was long gone by the time he came back. After about an hour of doing just that, Charles went back into Harrington, Delaware. He got on his street and was shocked when he saw the stranger who had just tried to kill him walking down the road right in front of him. But luckily, the stranger did not hear or see Charles pull onto the street, so Charles immediately threw it in reverse and drove off. At this point, Charles decided he needed to tell the police because he didn't know if this stranger actually knew him and maybe he was targeting him, waiting for him at his property. So he called 911 and told the dispatcher about what had happened earlier and how this guy was now lurking around his property. The dispatcher told him they would send an officer out to him. A few minutes later, an officer showed up at the pay phone where Charles was, and they told Charles they would escort him back to his property. If this stranger was still in the area, they would arrest him. When they got there, the stranger was long gone. Charles went into his house. There was no sign of a break-in, no sign that anyone was near his property. So Charles thanked the officer, relieved. But before the officer left, he asked him if he wouldn't mind doing a quick sweep of his mother's property. She lived right behind Charles, on the other side of some bushes. He told the officer her name was Dorothy, she was 70 years old, and she lived alone. He just wanted to make sure nothing happened to her. The officer said, "No problem, I'll go check on her." So the officer left Charles and went across his backyard, through those bushes, into Dorothy's backyard. Right away, he could see the back window on the back door had been smashed, and the door itself was slightly ajar. So the officer drew their pistol, went up, and entered the house. They looked inside, yelling for Dorothy, but there was no answer. It was totally dark in the house, totally silent. After searching the first floor and finding nothing, they made their way up the flight of stairs. They found blood at the top of the landing. They followed this trail of blood, which led them into one of the bedrooms, where a woman was sprawled out on a bed. It was Dorothy, she had been stabbed to death. It would turn out that after Charles had ditched the stranger and sped off without him, the stranger, whose name was Gilbert Cannon, began looking for a place to sleep. The house he ultimately selected just happened to be Charles's mother's house. After Gilbert broke in through her back door, he saw Dorothy coming down the steps to confront him. Because he was worried she'd be able to identify him, he attacked her with a screwdriver. Gilbert would later tell the police that the attack on Charles was completely random. He was just at this fast food restaurant, saw Charles get into his truck, and thought to himself, "If I can get in that guy's truck, I bet I can rob him." And then, after this failed robbery, when Gilbert was out looking for a place to sleep and he broke into this house, and a woman came down the stairs, he attacked and killed her. He had no idea that this woman, Dorothy, was Charles's mother. The entire night was one big horrible coincidence. Gilbert would plead guilty to the murder and would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Charles was devastated by the loss of his mother. He couldn't believe that the stranger he had encountered earlier that night had gone on to kill her. He felt guilty for not calling the police sooner, for not doing more to protect her. The police investigation revealed that Gilbert Cannon had a long history of violence and criminal behavior. He had been in and out of prison several times and had a reputation for being ruthless and unpredictable. Charles's encounter with Gilbert had been a chance meeting, but it had ended in tragedy. Charles couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if he had never stopped at the fast food restaurant that night, if he had never given Gilbert a ride. The thought haunted him for years to come, a reminder of the randomness of violence and the devastating consequences of one chance encounter. Gilbert Cannon was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no remorse for his crime, no regret for the pain and suffering he had caused. Charles, on the other hand, was left to pick up the pieces, to try to make sense of the senseless. He knew that he would never forget his mother, never forget the night that Gilbert Cannon took her away from him. The story of Charles and Gilbert is a tragic reminder of the dangers of chance encounters, of the unpredictable nature of violence. It is a story that will stay with you long after you finish reading it, a haunting reminder of the fragility of life.